Good evening. I call the special meeting of the Ames City Council for Tuesday, January 31st to order. Evening, Council. We have one item under hearings tonight. So does Council have any questions for staff on the Prairie View Industrial Center Water and Sanitary Sewer Connection Fee District? Oh, okay. I will declare the public hearing on this particular item to be open. Richard, do you want to talk to the Prairie View Industrial Center water?
I am opposed to it.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to address council on this item? If you just state your name and then you may proceed.
Okay. Good evening. Randy Brecky.
Thank you.
Live east of town, about as far east as you can. We own a parcel, my wife's here as well, but we own parcel 42 on the attachment that was sent out, which is approximately 35 and a half acres. And we intend to build a home that would encompass about 5 acres of that land. And I was just wanting to clarify that we would only be subjected to the one-time connection fee that was in our letter of the $30 and then times the $80 per foot.
Okay.
So, primarily because that property doesn't need to be subdivided.
Okay. All right.
That's
Anything
my
else?
question. Nope.
All right. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you.
We'll get your question answered before we close after we close public input. Anybody else? All right. We'll close public input on this hearing. John, can you answer that question, or someone else answer that question on the connection district and the one-time fee?
Sure. So parcel 41 has the existing residence, from my understanding, and that's included in the ordinance as having that exemption for the residential use. However, parcel 42, and then I believe they also own 43 and 44, would be included as the ordinance is currently written in the connection fees, the full connection fees.
However, what if they build their house?
If they build a house on parcel 42, are they eligible for that exemption because it's a separate parcel?
Right. My understanding from speaking with planning and housing is that they would be eligible to build a house on 42. And if they had set it back far enough from the new sewer infrastructure, farther than 200 feet, then they would have the opportunity to do a septic system. And also with our agreement with the former Central Iowa Water, now IRUA, they would be considered a continuing customer. So they could be customers of the rural water utility and have that septic service if they were 200 feet or more from the new infrastructure.
Tracy, do you want to add something?
Yes, so in the ordinance that you have before you, there is an opportunity for an exemption. And so that's basically the request this evening is, instead of treating 42 as the per acre cost, he's asking to be able to do one connection at that residential rate for 42 that was not originally included in that ordinance.
So help council follow. So they are eligible for a one-time exemption, or they need to have something in this ordinance to make that happen?
You would authorize the exception that they're requesting. So we wrote with the ordinance, it says existing residents, but they have not built the residence
Got it.
that they're wanting to build on 42. So they want to have that same rate for building on 42 that they get for the existing home on 41. The $30 times 80 instead of the full acreage.
So is there any changes necessary to the ordinance before council tonight in order to accomplish what he has asked for?
So you could do it two different ways. You could pass it as is, and then you could make a motion to allow one residential connection on 42, or you could direct amendments to the ordinance to include 42 as treating it as an existing residence, even though it's not an existing because it's not built yet.
My hesitation is I'd like to do something more broadly rather than specifically per property. Are there other property owners that would be similarly situated to the Breckies?
Some of the residential that were out there actually have been bought. The ones that we included as existing residential have been bought by Alliant Energy for incorporating into the bigger developments. So this is the only one that we've been brought to our attention that wants a new home. There is one other home that has already paid the residential rate to connect for sewer.
So maybe this is sort of a limited situation where it truly is just sort of a one property that would be adversely affected by this, and maybe that we should just give that one property owner. It's not something we do customarily, but maybe that's an exception.
And that is why we had the paragraph about if there was something that we had not thought out that came up, that there was the ability to come to city council for that exception.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
Procedurally, Mark, if proceed with the ordinance tonight for the first passage, could you just walk council through, can that change be made? We probably could have public input on the second reading because of the fact that it's being changed.
Right.
But so make sure that we don't proceed, or we just go ahead and table it tonight if council wants to make the change. How would you advise to proceed?
Tracy, I'm right. There's language in the ordinance that provides for an exception. Okay, thank you. Okay.
So 5A lists certain parcels that say that they get that there's existing single and multifamily residential use. And so they get a one-time connection using that 80 front foot lineal feet for the connection fee calculations. And that was a resolution that city council passed back in, I believe, 2019 when we were working on this project originally. And so you could take action to amend to include 42 into that section. But I'll let Mark,
Yep.
now that he has it in front of me.
Now that I have it in front of me, yes, I agree. So 5A, if you just amend it to add parcel 42 to that list, then that should take care of it. So just a motion to amend it to add 42 to that list on.
Okay,
on 5A.
historically, we try and avoid amending ordinances
Right.
at the dais, but if this is an exception that you think is simple enough and warranted, and
It's a very simple amendment. Yeah.
Mayor, we read from.
all right. Any other discussion or questions for Mark or Tracy or John?
So do you feel that there was adequate time, that no one else is going to say, oh, we were going to build a house also and would have liked that rate?
So we emailed notifications and we mailed notifications to the residents or the property owners that we had said was originally going to come on the January 10th city council meeting. Then we reached back out saying it's delayed until the 31st. So they've had adequate notice to contact us if they had other plans. We did have one of the residents contact us saying, hey, get Alliant Energy to make us an offer because we may want to sell. So there's movement out there just in lots of different directions.
Okay, thank you.
It's I guess I had assumed that Alliant had pretty much options on most of the property for that to become Prairie View out there, but apparently that's not the case.
No, I think there's like 1,300 acres and they have had options on maybe 700 and some
Okay.
of those acres.
All right. Any other questions? Otherwise, I entertain a motion either the move on the first passage as is or to amend.
Mayor, I move that we amend section 5A to include parcel 42.
Second.
All right, any discussion? All right, let's do a roll call on that first.
Aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Thank you. I entertain a motion on first passage of the ordinance as amended.
Move on first. Second.
Thank you. Roll call.
Aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right, thank you. So Tracy, if you want to talk to Randy, and you can fill him in on whatever else you need to talk about then. All right. Thank you. All right, we'll move on to the first item on the workshop, or the item on the workshop, and that is the bicycle and pedestrian master plan. And for those that may be here of particular interest, there will not be any public input taken during the workshop, but I'm going to ask John to explain what has been going on with terms of input and how people can continue to give public input on the plan.
Sure, there's been significant public input to date, and Adam will go over in some greater detail what that input is through the presentation. And then we'll have continuing input all along through the process. And some of that will be detailed in the presentation as well. But we've had open public input to date, and we will continue to solicit and accept input as we move forward.
And just to restate that council highly values public input, and we appreciate what's been done so far and want that to continue. So just because we don't have oral input at the podium tonight, it means that we still do want to have input through the process. So,
Very much so. Thank
all
you.
right, very good. Thank you. We'll turn it over to Damien. And
I'll just add one more thing before giving it to Adam. On the city's website, so cityofames.org/walkbikeroll, you'll notice that we have a specific email address. So if people do have comments tonight that they wanted to provide it specifically, it's walkbikeroll, no spaces, at cityofames.org. And we'll get that email to the project team. I'll turn it over to Adam, and you can go over our workshop items.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Damien, and thanks for having me. It's always good to visit Ames. As a reminder, my name is Adam Wood. I am a consultant with Tool Design, and I'm based out of Madison, Wisconsin, and am the project manager from the consultant team on this work. In the presentation, which I believe you all have gotten an advanced copy of, there's really three main sections. I want to talk to you a little bit about the public input received to date, what we've learned, and then what are our next steps. Give you a very high level overview of the existing conditions analysis. I could probably present for 2 hours on that and answer questions for a few more hours. And while I think it's all fascinating, I'm sure you would rather not spend that much of your life listening to me ramble about data. And then the last thing is to give you a sneak preview of the wayfinding concepts that we have developed so far, and as one of the first key steps to the wayfinding element of this project. Feel free to interrupt me as I go through if you have any questions or want clarifications. As a reminder, our public input plan for this project has 3 phases, and we're really at the point of wrapping up the first phase, which is about raising awareness of the project, talking about what is important to people in Ames in terms of walking and biking, what do we need, and sort of where do we want to go. We also, as I mentioned, are introducing wayfinding and what that could mean and what that could look like. Once we wrap this up, we move on to the second phase, which is where we start to actually develop out the proposed network and get input and feedback on that. Any additions to bikeways, to intersection crossing improvements, locations where those may need to be, and so forth, and start to look a little bit more into the details of what the work may look like in the future. We'll also present more refined sign concepts and start to look at the actual design of some of the wayfinding signs and some test placement in a few key locations to kind of do a little proof of concept as part of this work. And then the third phase will be the actual draft plan review. So once we've put the plan documents together, made all the recommendations, priority lists, all of that sort of stuff, the opportunity then for public review and feedback on the overall draft plan. The first phase of engagement, we had really a focus on virtual and online engagement. And this is a byproduct of the COVID-19 pandemic. We had to move toward virtual and online engagement. And then it turns out that was actually really advantageous for a lot of people and preferable for a lot of people. So we continue to leverage that and use that to also we augmented that with some in-person engagement. Damien mentioned the project website, which includes a fair amount of information. We also sent out a kickoff email to a variety of your city newsletter email lists to announce the project. We had an online poll and a survey, and I'll tell you the results of those both here in a minute. And then some social media posts as well to help to just drive traffic to the website and let people know that this work is getting going. The online poll we had was put up very early in the project, and it was a very simple one question. We asked people to finish the sentence, walking, biking, and rolling in Ames should be. We did not ask demographic. I mean, it was purely a one box. You could fill in an answer. So we don't have any demographic information or anything. And this was a way to really get some ideas generated early, but also give people an opportunity to start providing input into the project. I'm sure you've all seen a word cloud before, but this is just representing the words that came up most often. And I'll point out that there are some perhaps duplications. So you see the word easy and easier. Those are both in there. And if you think about adding those together, the word easy would be pretty large. But safety and ease of use and accessibility were really the themes that came up quite a bit in those roughly 140 responses that we received to this question. And that really reflects what we heard through the online survey as well. The survey was open for about a month late last year, and we received nearly 400 responses. As I mentioned, this was advertised in various methods to generate that traffic. I want to first touch on who took the survey and talk a little bit about the demographics, because we do think it's important to understand the context of who's answering these questions. When we looked at gender, we skewed a little bit more toward male respondents than female, and with 7% rather, who preferred not to answer the question. I would say, as far as surveys on active transportation goes, it is very common for males to be more likely to take the survey than females. Usually it's more skewed than this, so I would say this is a pretty good result. We looked at race and ethnicity of respondents. Compared to the city population, there was a higher proportionality of people that identify as white that took the survey, as well as people that identify as Native American. There were disproportionately low people that identify as African American or Black or Asian or Latino, Latina, or Hispanic that took the survey. Again, this is a fairly common result that we have, but it is still something to pay attention to. So when we interpret these results, to think about how representative might they be, and where do we need to think a little bit more into the nuance of things. Age-wise, again, very underrepresented in the population ages 18 to 24, which, with Iowa State University being here, that's a pretty significant aspect to keep in mind. We did do, as part of the way to account for this, we did do an in-person tabling event on the ISU campus to get some input from students that way. I do also want to point out that while the overall numbers are relatively small, we did get participation or input from a number of people who identified as having some sort of physical disability or ability differences in terms of being deaf or blind, or having hearing or vision limitations, as well as physical mobility limitations as well. And it's important to remember those.
Adam, one question. I try not to ask too many questions on the demographic part, but it's very interesting. So we're trying to create a really great system in Ames, in part for our children, and we're intentionally not getting input from them. So would we think about their input from the perspective of perhaps their parents?
Mm-hmm.
And so people who are parents, they're going to speak with the lenses of making a safe place for themselves and for their children. Is that the way we should think about this?
That's a really good question, and is certainly a key aspect with regard to thinking about all the ways in which people do or may want to walk, bike, and roll, is whether they're alone, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but whether they're alone or whether they're with another family member, and the age of the family member and so forth is going to determine their level of comfort in certain situations, their willingness to go a certain distance, and things along those lines. I think that the results of the survey speak to trying to create places that are more safe and comfortable and so forth, which I think does respond and reflect to what would be needed from a child's perspective for walking and biking. I think it is I don't believe we asked a question about are you a parent of children between a certain age or not, which is something we could do in a future poll or survey to get more nuanced information that way. But it is something that we do take into very strong consideration when we are working on active transportation plans. We are not doing a safe routes to school plan for you, but we do have that mindset about the needs of children, from birth to adulthood, in terms of access and being able to use the system safely.
Great. Thanks for that answer.
Sure.
Very helpful.
So I do have one additional point of clarification on age.
Mhm.
So what I'm seeing here with the 18 to 24-year-olds, if I'm reading it correctly, is that we really didn't get any online input from the college students because we had 40 people engaged on campus, or around 40, and it looks like we've got about 10% in that age group. Is that an accurate way to read that?
I would say that it is. So I have had the opportunity to work with the city and on projects in the past, as well as with campus planning over at ISU. And it is my understanding is it is kind of a recurring challenge to get large quantities of input, a large number of people participating in these sorts of processes. And I think part of it may be I know when I was 18, 19 years old, I was focused on things other than taking surveys.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that could be part of it. Yes, the participation in this was quite low. There, were the link was shared with various ISU organizations to distribute as well to their membership, but I'm not sure how the reach of how far that went.
I only wanted clarification on that because we are trying to figure out what the most effective ways of communicating are. And that looks to me like it's saying we really need to go to campus to meet with the students as opposed to sending out the link and hoping they'll respond to it.
Well, one thing I might add too is that, that's one of the reasons why we have that community advisory committee, because it has more of a targeted, getting more of those representation from that group who are motivated rather than kind of a general solicitation out to the public and then get feedback that way. But I think these are good metrics because they also, to your point, when we start to use strategies for public input, we can track these things. And even if maybe they're not what we want to see them today, as we move forward, we can really see, like, is that maybe new technique or changing or adapting the technique? Is it resulting in actually changing some of these numbers? So I think that's my takeaway from this slide, is that some of those groups do need different strategies, and I think we'll try those out and see if we can get better participation for that broader group rather than, but we still have our community advisory was a good targeted group.
Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the results of what we heard. We asked people to talk about their relationship with Ames, essentially just trying to figure out whether they live here, work here, go to school, and visit. And the majority of participants live in the city, and pretty significant majority also work here. We asked people how often they use each mode, and from top to bottom, in case you can't quite read that, mobility device, electric skate or scoot, skate or scoot without the electric aspect. We asked about electric biking versus non-electric biking, and then walking or running. And what you'll see on this is that walking or running and biking non-electric are the modes that are used by the majority of people that took the survey, at least at some point in time. And you can see that these more emerging modes are, less than 10% of the population generally uses it with any sort of regularity. But what is noticeable is here is half your population is walking or running on a daily basis, which is, obviously great from a public health perspective, but also tells us that there is a good opportunity and a need there to look at safety and comfort and convenience for people walking. We also asked people what they would like to do more. People said they would like to walk more and bike more as well. And so comparing this previous chart where the biking's a bit lower than the walking compared to this one, that does show that there is maybe a bit of a mismatch there, that there's a desire to bike more than people are currently able to do. But either way, these are pretty strong metrics that there is a desire to do more of those things. The skating and scooting bit was pretty low, but when we think about accommodating people using skateboards or scooters, whether electric or not, there's a lot of correlation with how we think about designing and planning for biking. So when we think about facilities that work well for people biking, those can also carry over into scooting or skating, especially when we're talking about shared use paths, trails, and the like. We asked people where they're going. The size of these rectangles reflects the number of people that said these types of things were destinations. And for both walking and biking, parks and green space was the number one destination. Schools and universities were number two. And then walking was first restaurants and entertainment, and then shopping, and biking was the other way around. What is really interesting about this, and what I want to point out, is work is a relatively small square on here. So think back 10 years ago when we were planning for walking and biking, and everything was about commuting, and it was, how do we get more people biking to work? Well, that's not where people are currently going when they're walking and biking. And when we look at national statistics about trips that people make, only 1 out of roughly 7 trips is a trip to work. People are going to run errands, they're going to buy food, whether at the grocery store or at a restaurant. There's all sorts of other things people are doing. And so it's really important to think about those utilitarian trips. We asked people, similarly to whether they want to do these things more, how they would like to get to different types of destinations. And, not surprising, people do want to continue to walk and bike to parks and green spaces. Wanting to walk and bike to restaurants and entertainment is also a really high proportion of the responses, as is shopping. I would say the work bars, while relatively low, is higher than what people are currently doing. So there is some desire, I think, for people to be able to commute on foot or by bike. What you'll see is generally speaking, there's pretty strong interest in being able to walk and bike to most places. Obviously, or for some reason, going to the doctor is not something. Maybe people don't want to go to the doctor. I don't know, but that's not something that came up as super high. And that could just be the reality of where medical appointments are relative to where people live. They may see it as being a destination that's too far away. We asked people what they think the most important thing is for us to do as part of this project. And there were, the ability for people to write, to provide different answers. And we counted the number of top things that people responded to. And the most important was more places to bike, but a very, very close number 2, which I would say statistically, it's practically a tie, is safer places to cross the street. I'll show you maps in a minute about where your sidewalks are. And as you probably know, you have sidewalks along most of your streets. And so it's not that there's necessarily a lack of places to walk. It's about getting across the street. And as we know from statistics, if you are walking and you are involved in a crash, it is likely to either happen when you're crossing the street or crossing a driveway. So it's that interaction with motor vehicle traffic that is really a limitation and a safety concern. So I do want to move on to talk a little bit about the in-person engagement that we did. As I mentioned earlier, there was a booth at the Iowa State Sustainability Fair that we held in October, that they held in October and that our team participated in. We had roughly 40 people that stopped by the table, and the majority of those were students. And I think that is notable, in part because, at least in my personal experience working in Ames, and including working on projects for Iowa State University, when we've done surveys, we've gotten a lot of faculty and staff participation, not as much student participation. So this was something that really engaged with students. So I think that's worth noting. We asked about walking and biking and what that should be like in Ames, as well as what people don't like currently. And people wrote their responses on Post-it notes and stuck them on boards and so forth, but this is kind of the aggregated summary of it. There's the positive aspects are the exercise. People find it to be convenient and inexpensive. The paths are appreciated, as well as the access to scenery and parks and nature. Some of the things that people don't like, unfortunately, you can't really do much about, including the cold and the weather. There are some things, however, that the city could address potentially. Path surface condition, interactions with cars, whether it's dealing with speeding or providing better crossings. There was mention of lack of paths and bike lanes, and I think you have a pretty wide network considering the size of your community, but obviously there are still some gaps. There are still some places that don't have those connections. The question then about what people think walking and biking in Ames should be, again, earlier I showed you that word cloud with words like safe and convenient, easy, but enjoyable comes up here, which I think is a good characteristic for us to think about. The convenient and comfortable is there as well, and safety obviously pops up too. So then I want to talk a little bit about the Community Advisory Committee, and we discussed this when we were here, when I was here last time. We've had some schedule delays and some challenges in recruitment in terms of getting, commitments from a significant number of people. And so what we have talked about and in the direction we're moving forward is to actually adjust our approach a little bit. We have a number of people that were nominated for the Community Advisory Committee. And so what we have done is given them a vision and goals survey based on some of what we talked about last time we were here, as well as invited, and we have not scheduled these yet, but we will invite the Community Advisory Committee members to attend 3 meetings that we're going to hold in closer succession to kind of get more of a feedback on the various concepts and ideas that are coming out of this process. So they will, we'll ask them to finalize vision and goals. We will provide an overview of existing conditions like I'm going to show you tonight, talk about the facility types, different types of bikeway treatments, and get input on recommendations for the network and wayfinding, and then how we prioritize projects moving forward. So those have yet to be scheduled. I'm anticipating the first one of those potentially being in February and probably lasting through April. I mentioned the vision and goals survey, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But before we really get into it, I do want to do a little bit of a preview of what's the thought process was in terms of how we moved from our previous discussions about goals and vision into the survey and kind of moving forward. And it's based in thinking about the diversity of people and the diversity of reasons in which people walk and bike in Ames. Starting with walking, the graphics on the slide show, and these are from different projects that we've worked on. They show a variety of people with different types of characteristics that's going to influence their experience with walking. Some people choose to walk. Some people walk because they don't have an alternative mode. They don't have a car. They don't have access or can't ride a bike for whatever reason. There are things like physical abilities and vision and hearing that can influence and affect somebody's experience when they're walking. Age can determine a lot of things. Feeling of security can be a factor, as well as how long it takes you to get across the street. Does that walk signal give you enough time to get across the street, for example? Cultural conventions, gender identity, all of these things can influence people's experience out in the public realm. I mentioned earlier, children, whether you're by yourself or with children, do you need to carry things can have an effect. Similarly, when we think about biking, it's not, people that bike are not a monolith. There's not one type of bicyclist out there. You may have seen a graphic like this in the past. This is something that across the biking, bike planning industry gets a lot of traction, which is classifying people based on their tolerance for interacting with motor vehicle traffic. You may notice these percentages don't add up to 100. That's because roughly 33% of people say they are not interested in biking. It doesn't really matter what you do. So when we look at the people that are interested in biking, there is a percentage that is comfortable pretty much everywhere. They're probably the people that are already out there biking. They probably go bike a few hundred miles a year or a few hundred miles a day, maybe. There's a group that's somewhat confident. But then you have this, roughly half of your total population that is really interested in biking, but they don't want to interact with motor vehicle traffic. They don't feel safe with it, interacting with cars and so forth. That's one way to look at it, and we certainly keep that in mind. But again, a lot of those factors I mentioned earlier can impact somebody's experience out there. You may have two people that are both in that interested but concerned group, but they may be of different genders. They may have different physical appearances in terms of skin tone or hairstyle that may make them feel more like comfortable being out biking in the street around drivers who they don't know, how they're going to react to somebody biking in the roadway. The distance can have an effect. I think whether someone is here for the short term, if they're a student that's planning to live here for 4 years versus somebody who's been here their whole life, those can all have effects in how people experience biking in a community. So we want to keep all that in mind. And I wanted to just spend a few minutes going through that, because this is going to be something throughout this project, and the ultimate plan is going to hit on this diversity of people and their experiences and what they're trying to get at.
Adam, go back to that slide just
Sure.
one moment. So are this national statistics or is this Ames?
These are national statistics. Yes. Thank you for asking for that clarification.
So given Ames has a very unique demographic in that we're half students, you think that changes the way we think about that chart?
I think it certainly can. These classifications were dreamed up by a public works engineer for the city of Portland back 10-something years ago. And there have been various studies and polls, both nationally and regionally across the country, that have asked people questions to kind of get at these classifications. And while it may vary, it does tend to be within 5 to 10% of what these numbers show. So it could be statistically significantly different there, but I would say that you probably still have the bulk of your population would fall more in that interested but concerned category overall.
Okay, thanks.
Well, we do have slides later on in the presentation that talk about some of the data related to biking, both the community-wide and around the campus area. And Adam will talk about kind of what the data tells us about, are we capturing bike trips that we should be capturing, and why we're not, and how we can build strategies around capturing those type of trips, mainly based upon their length and their purpose.
Well, I agree with you, Adam. I think this is a very important chart because it affects the way we think about safety and other measures we put in place. So thanks for bringing that up.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the survey then. First, who took it? The survey was sent out to both the Community Advisory Committee and the Technical Advisory Committee, and it was roughly 50-50, give or take, in terms of who took the survey. The age is obviously very representative of who is on the committees, but there was at least some spread. We had people from the 18 to 24 group as well as from the other end of the spectrum. The majority of people that took the survey live and work in Ames. And again, the gender breakdown is going to relate to some degree to who is on the committees, but it was a little bit lopsided toward male people that identify as male taking the survey.
So how many people actually took it? It looks like there are only 16.
There was 16.
But the numbers under what your age don't add up to 16. They add up to 19, don't they?
You're much faster on your mental math than I am. Yep.
I'm an English professor. I can do addition. That's this is my wheelhouse here. But I'm just curious because then, of course, you've got the 34 in the relationship to Ames. So I'm assuming that's because they could choose multiple.
They could choose multiple ones.
Okay.
On this. Yeah. So you could select all three of those. Yeah. But I will look into the difference in age. I had not noticed that. Okay. So what we did was based on the input we had received to date through the poll and the survey and the tabling event at ISU, the input that you provided the last time I was here to present, put together just a draft vision statement that captured a lot of the sentiments that we had heard. It's on the slide, but it says walking, biking, and rolling is important to the Ames community, and we envision the day when every person, regardless of age, ability, or identity, can walk, bike, and roll safely and comfortably to all their essential destinations in Ames. Streets will be designed, programs will be implemented, and the community will foster a culture to support walking, biking, and rolling for all. We then asked people in an open-ended format to tell us what they liked about it or what they didn't like about it. And what people said they liked was the fact that it is a vision statement. It describes what we're trying to be. It talks a lot about inclusivity, and that it encompasses the every person aspect. Some of the things people said they didn't like, it could be more inclusive. And then a lot of these are about just how lengthy it is, and it's a little bit wordy, which reading it again, I agree with, especially since I just read it out loud. There were also a couple of comments in here about questioning the reality of everyone, including everyone in it. There were a couple of responses to that end. However, that was something that came up as something that people liked. We broke this vision statement down into a series of components and asked people what they thought was the most important. And you can see that the every resident, regardless of age, ability, or identity, was actually identified as the most important aspect of it. So I think that is worth keeping in there, even though a couple people had questioned the feasibility of it. The second most important thing people identified was walking, biking, and rolling safely to all essential destinations in Ames. And in hindsight, I really think there's two parts to that. Maybe we should have split it. There's the safety aspect, and then there is the all destinations aspect of it. And then you'll see street design and community culture also came up as being important. So what we did was take all of that into consideration and provide a proposed revised vision statement that is shorter. It says Ames is a place where walking, biking, and rolling is safe, comfortable, enjoyable, convenient, and available to everyone, regardless of age, ability, identity, race, or economic status. Now, we also have a series of goals that breaks down into more specifics, but this is based on the input received, kind of crafted from what we've heard from the community. Where we are right now. We have not shared this back yet with the committees for their feedback and reaction, but did want to put this out there to you all and see if you had any reactions or thoughts to it.
I agree. The first one was too wordy, so I like the second one better. I was thinking you could even cut out one more word because in my mind, comfortable and enjoyable are close enough to this. They're not distinguishable from each other enough for me. You could just make it one word shorter. That's my thought. Probably, oh gosh, your dealer's choice. They're both, they mean the same to me. Let
the committee decide.
Yeah, I'm not picky there, but.
Feels like from just our experience that people tend to use the word enjoyable more often than comfortable.
As an English professor, I got hung up on the is safe because walking, biking, and rolling is a compound subject, which means there are multiple modes and it's a singular verb. And I know that's pedantic
Okay.
of me,
Yeah, I
but
would say no,
it drives me nuts to see that. Shouldn't it be are safe? Because we are talking about three different modes of moving on wheels.
Ames is a place which is safe. Ames is one place which is safe. Right.
No, it's the second is goes with the phrase where, etc. Yeah. Trust me.
I do.
All right.
But anyway, that hung
Very
me
good.
up a little bit. And then I wondered, I noticed that people thought it was really important to have the regardless statement. But if it's available to everyone, if we start listing, do we run into that problem of we haven't listed all the different categories that there might be, and then so some people feel left out or they don't feel that their needs have been identified. I know why it's there, but I'm not sure that it's as effective as it could be. And I don't know how you make it more effective except creating an even longer list.
Yeah, good point. I could live without it as well. I think everyone is everyone. Good point.
So you got this originally from us, is that correct? The phrasing?
No, the phrasing we developed based on the
Okay.
input.
Okay, based on the input. Yeah, I mean, my only comment is that sometimes those kinds of words show some intentionality about, we know when we say everyone that we are really mean everyone. But
Yeah, and that really is the intent with some of these things, because I think it focuses on, when we think about active transportation and who, all those slides I was showing previously about all of these sort of different factors that change people's experiences. It is the things like age and abilities that are, that have a pretty substantial impact in terms of people's ability to go a distance, ability to go a certain speed, cognitive ability, which is also associated with age, to understand how fast a vehicle is approaching an intersection, things along those lines. So that's the reason. And then, as far as when we think about, transportation justice and how, which people have been historically and in an ongoing fashion sort of disinvested in the transportation system or disproportionately negatively affected, it is often around things like race and economic status. So that's why those particular words were included in there.
So Adam, or Damien, who's responsible for approving a vision statement, council or the CIC?
No, it's we're using the various community groups to help guide and make recommendations, but it's council's. It will be ultimately council's plan.
Is this the night where you want to go ahead and have direction on this one or not?
Yes, you certainly can give us direction about the wording that you would like to change.
Okay, I'd like to keep this thing going. I'd entertain a motion for a revised wording on this, so we can go ahead and get a motion. And
Well, hasn't this not been seen by the CAC yet?
That's other than right now, and perhaps if they saw these materials. I would say that this does not. My main question is, regardless of the wording and the cement, does this capture, generally speaking, is there disagreement with what this is trying to get at, or does this generally align with what you're hoping for? That's the main thing that we would like to kind of get, a sense of. And then, there certainly can be opportunities at a later point between now and when the plan is ultimately presented for adoption to wordsmith this.
I guess I'm not getting too wrapped around this poll. Is there a town in America who wouldn't say they want a place where walking, biking is safe, comfortable, and so on? Man, it just seems fairly general.
Agreed.
I don't want to think too hard about it.
can we just let them
Okay.
view this revised one and?
Sure.
Okay.
And obviously, we will later on, when we talk about kind of what these things mean and the tools that we use to define whether we're achieving this goal. That's something that we'll talk about here later in this presentation. So.
Okay. All right. Well, then moving on to the goal setting. If you recall, we talked with you about goals and talked about sort of best practices in goal setting for active transportation plans, and that equity, mode share, and safety are what we see as being the three foundational pieces. We presented these in the survey, asked people to tell us what they thought of these categories and whether they should be included. Safety was basically unanimously agreed upon, and I'm noticing 19 is more than 7 + 9 earlier. So I think maybe some people did not answer the question as to which committee they were on, but since the survey was sent out only to our committee lists. I know they were on one committee and not another, or they were at least on one of the committees. Equity was the one that had the least amount of support. And so we asked people what other categories they thought maybe should be included. There was one about using accessibility rather than equity, cleaner environment, better public health, improving commuting, and so forth were some of the ideas that were put out there.
Adam, could you go back just for a second? I apologize. So I have in mind what I think of as equity and how I want this to work. But is that a phrase that you think everyone is in agreement with what it means?
I'd say that question is way above my pay grade.
Well, and we could spend an hour just sort of parsing through this, but if we're serious about having equity as part of this equation, and I would like it to be, I think we should have some sense of what that would mean. So, for example, I would like to take our existing bike infrastructure and lay it over socioeconomic demographics to see, are there pockets of our community that we're just not missing or we're just not hitting with our bike infrastructure? That's what I mean by equity.
Yeah. And we do have, we have not done that yet, but we do have that as part of our scope of work.
Okay.
And I think you touched on a very good point. Like, for the purpose of this plan, it is ultimately an infrastructure plan. It will solve a piece of the puzzle of our community, not the whole social framework of it.
Right.
But so one of the things that we want to make sure is, from a transportation perspective, is that you have as close to equal access to transportation, regardless of your ability to afford it, to physically use it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. Thank you.
Yep.
So on the safety and mode shift components of it, we asked people, and we gave a few options, which two of the following do you think are most important for improving safety, or most important reasons for wanting to switch people to walking and biking rather than driving? On the safety aspect, eliminating fatalities and serious injuries was the top response. Obviously, reducing crashes and increasing comfort and improving quality of life are also results of improving safety, but a very clear need to focus on the elimination of fatalities and serious injuries. On the question about mode shift, the switching trips from driving to walking, biking, and rolling, there was a focus on health, but I would say the climate goals and improving connectivity and access pieces were pretty close there. On equity, we asked people to tell us in their own words why they think it's important to focus on equity. And I'm not going to read all of these, but recognition that we're a diverse community, that equity is part of a broader conversation that we're having. The role of government in social justice and so forth were all identified as reasons. So I would say, based on the comments, it is in the way people answered this, I think does get at the recognition from an economic and racial, historic disparity aspect that is, maybe we're not all verbatim the same in terms of the definition of equity, but I do think that there are some common themes woven in here. So we took all of that and have developed a set of revised goals. As with the revised vision statement, this hasn't been shared back with the committees yet, but wanted to put these out there again for just any initial reactions. We did go from the 3 to 4, and sort of as I spoke the last time we were here, talked about putting the Ames flavor on these components. So this still does hit on those 3 main building blocks, but it is tailored to what we have heard. So the first goal is safe and comfortable. And phrased that way because safety is very measurable in terms of, did a crash happen or not. Comfortable is a little bit different. You may have an intersection where you haven't been hit, but it may not feel comfortable to you. It may not feel safe. So safe and comfortable, and that deals with planning, designing, street operation, and so forth. Streets, sidewalks, bikeways, crossings, and paths. Prior to safety, and pulled out this ultimate goal of eliminating fatalities as part of that. Connected and easy. This gets at the mode shift piece, but hits on something, 2 words, connected and easy, that really came out through the poll and the survey and a lot of things that we've heard about creating connections, making it easy and intuitive to use, encouraging more people to walk, bike, and roll. Healthy and sustainable is about getting, again, mode shift, getting more people walking, biking, and rolling, through in a nod to what the future may hold in terms of other forms of transportation. There's a lot of, change happening in terms of electrification and small electric personal mobility vehicles and all that sort of thing, to, not only reduce carbon, but to improve health. And then equitable and accessible, invest equitably, and make sure that infrastructure is easy to use regardless of your age or physical ability. And then also to augment the infrastructure with programs that encourage and empower everyone to choose active transportation. So again, sort of a straw man set of goals now for committees to review and react to and wordsmith. And, again, at some point you will certainly have the opportunity to recommend changes or modifications to these, but yeah.
It's kind of funny that there's 4, but there's really 8. Like each one has an and. So yeah, but they're all different too. So you could list that as 8 too. That'll be. I mean, it's fine as it is too. I'm not picky, but it's 8.
Have we had biking and rolling fatalities in Ames? I know that we've had some walking fatalities with train encounters, and I assume with some automobiles.
Yeah, there has been either walking and biking fatalities. They're extremely random and thankfully extremely rare. And they're typically more for this type of effort. We look at areas of like higher instances or higher just general, either they're deficient from a design standpoint, they have a history of other types of crashes, but we don't typically chase and kind of focus the plan around where fatality did happen, because when you drill down to the actual circumstances, they're quite random, and it's not usually something you can engineer your way out per se. But it's more of and that's why you see too, you might hear this going forward, like a safe systems approach, which is designing the network, the infrastructure, so if you do get in a crash, the things are safer, which is providing for walking and biking. What does that mean? That means buffering, that means protection, that means barriers, that means other kinds of things to eliminate that possibility of having, and affecting speed, bringing the speeds down is another thing. So that's how you would start to see how this plan is focusing on like the aspect of a fatality of walking and biking. Just lowers the threshold of that actually happening.
And then I have 2 questions about the equitable and accessible. First question is, when we're getting the recommendations in our plan, are we going to be looking at the policies that apply to our trails as well? So the ability to use motorized chairs or bikes on the trails? Is that?
Yeah, and I can answer. The tool is scoped to look at a policy review. So they'll look at our codes, look at our standards. And I think once we start to build and actually have a framework and come back to what are the new designs, what are new preferred and priorities of the plan, if it does run afoul of a particular code or standard or something like that, we'll make recommendations that we need to adjust. I think probably the thing that comes to my mind the most is that once this plan is adopted, I think we mentioned at the first meeting, want to make sure that it shows up in whatever kind of development requirements the city has, so that this plan is implemented not just for retrofitting, but for new construction and things like that. So it'll be, some of it might be given off to planning, for instance, and they would make code changes. Other things might be enforcement related. So yes, we'll have kind of a laundry list of things that need to be either modernized, removed, or adjusted.
Second question has to do with our trail system. I know at some point when I first got on council, there was a lot of discussion about the Vet Med Trail and whether it should be paved or whether it should remain gravel, and there were differences of opinion on that. The Complete Streets Plan, as I understand our philosophy, says that some streets are not appropriate for all modes of transportation, and therefore we prioritize bike routes or car routes in that planning. So when we're thinking about the trail system, are we going to take that same approach so that we have some trails that do remain gravel, or to make them accessible to everyone? Are we going to be trying to do a one-size-fits-all the trails will have to be accessible?
No, what I envision is that you will get, this plan will come back with a range of accommodations for walking and biking. So you might see in the densest, most populated parts of town, you might see a tendency to try and separate facilities. So we know we have enough walking, enough biking, enough vehicle traffic, et cetera, et cetera. They kind of all need their own space. And then as you move out into the rural areas, I could envision that we would have kind of a green belt standard that might have options for gravel or chip or some other kind of unpaved surface. But I think one of the things when we talked about the Vet Med Trail, as a reminder, was that since we don't just have, a lot of our trail network isn't just for a recreational, it's not a single purpose, that we tend to have a paved surface because that's how we can guarantee all year use. So for the people that are using for transportation, for other sorts of things, it's really difficult to provide a safe path that we can't do snow and ice control. I would say this plan, yes, would see a range of options.
I imagine that wheelchair users are going to have very specific needs for accessibility on some of the trails and paths that are different from bikers and walkers' needs. That's why I asked.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. All right. So the next part of the agenda is to talk a bit about existing conditions. We have three pieces of the existing conditions component of our project that we are working through: plan and policy review, a network evaluation, which is a very data analysis step, and then a state of active transportation report that is essentially an existing conditions summary that is not as technical as the network evaluations methodology memo is going to be. Very, very high level, I'm going to hit on plans and policies. We reviewed each of the plans that are listed are shown on the slide, as well as additional ones. And I have a full list of those I can pull up if we need to. But I did want to hit on, the key themes that came through with these plans is a multimodal vision for Ames. So, this plan that we're working on now really fits in with that. Discussion about safety and comfort for all users, expanding choice and providing more opportunities for people to walk, bike, and roll is an example of expanding transportation choice. Identifying priorities for investment. And in this project that we're working on, we are going to develop a bike and walk project prioritization methodology, as well as identify tiers of, here's your top tier of priority projects, second tier, that sort of thing. Designing with best practices, and the Complete Streets Plan was mentioned earlier, which already has some sidewalk and bikeway design guidance included in it. Crossing and intersection safety. I think it's no secret that Lincoln Way, especially between campus and campus town, is an area where there's a lot of conflicts happening. People walking, biking, bus, there's driving, obviously. There's a lot of interactions happening there. And you all have studied Lincoln Way a couple of times specifically. And then connectivity is a key aspect that comes through all these as well. Damien mentioned code review, and this is just a slide to talk about, sort of illustrate how we're doing this. We're pulling out sections that are relevant and identifying potential issues or concerns. And so as we get further into the project, these are places where we make some recommendations for some code revisions to kind of bring some things up to best practices and to better align with some of the goals and vision for the plan itself. Demographics of Ames. I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with these numbers, so I'm not trying to educate you on this, but rather just showing you sort of what we're looking at and what's influencing our view of this information. Income is one thing that we took a look at, and you have a really significant portion of your population that earns less than 15,000 a year. I think there's probably a really strong correlation there with the student body, more than likely. But that is relevant information for us to know. You have a significant portion of your population that does not have a vehicle available at 8%. Again, probably some correlation to the student body, but there are again factors for us to consider. Your percentage of people that bike to work, walk to work, and use transit is pretty high, I would say, for a community of your size, a community in Iowa. So that's something to be happy about. So we've taken all of this into consideration. We have taken your data on existing bikeways, and this is showing the on-street, bicycle-friendly streets and so forth, as well as your shared use path network, where things are today. We have updated some of this based on conversations with Damien and other staff members about some changes since the data was originally created. And as we go through with the network process, we're going to be looking at where are there gaps in this system, where are there things that maybe should be upgraded, where are some changes that could be made or connections that could be added. We looked at existing sidewalks, and the map on this slide is a little hard to see up on the projector screen, but what we were able to do was take an impervious surfaces layer that you have that has sidewalks identified on it and do some geospatial analysis that I just said a big phrase that makes me sound like I know what I'm talking about, but it's something I can't fully explain how it works. But we're able to take the data sets and take each of your street centerline segments and identify whether there was a sidewalk on one side, both sides, or no sides. So this isn't capturing every tiny little gap in the sidewalk segment. There was some assumptions we had to build into it, but it gave us a way to give you essentially an inventory of where your gaps are in the sidewalk network. So this is something as we get later on in the project, we could take each of these lines and prioritize them. So we can start to prioritize gaps in the sidewalk network based on proximity to destinations, proximity to various population groups, demographics, close to employment, all of those sorts of things.
So this is actually the slide that I'm most interested in.
Okay.
And where we look to you for your input and learning from best practices that you would bring. So as we think about prioritizing, there are different ways of doing that. So as we think about a cost benefit analysis, do we think about what has the most impact? I think this is confusing. I really do. I don't feel like I have a good sense of how do we rank these gaps. Is that something that at some point in the process you can help us, you give us tools for thinking through that?
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that I like to build a project like this is to solidify on some goals and figure out, what are we trying to achieve? And then use those goals to influence how we prioritize things. So safety is important. So let's take a look and see where are there potentially safety concerns? Where have crashes happened? Where might crashes? And I'm going to show you a slide in a minute that shows where crashes might happen. They might not have happened yet, but where could they potentially happen based on, various systemic safety considerations, which is related to the characteristics of the environment surrounding it. So that's one thing that could be used. If equity is a goal, we're going to look at are some of these existing conditions, are some neighborhoods disproportionately affected by some of these conditions, and if so, maybe that's something we want to try to address in prioritization. So we want to prioritize projects in those neighborhoods versus in other parts of the community. So all of that, those are different options. We're not there yet as far as how and what and in what weighting or ranking to provide or to put into those various factors, but that'll be part of the conversation.
That'll be key as we talked about during our CIP process, that kind of input will be helpful as then we prioritize what projects that we fund in our CIP.
Yeah, and it's just a reminder for anyone who is listening to this and interested, as council knows, the policy under the Complete Street Plan is that we evaluate, gaps in infrastructure during the project, and usually we have that 22%, if you remember from the plan, is the threshold, so that we would infill any missing sidewalk unless there's some other kind of impact negative impact, or like to do it would cost an increase to the project of more than 22%. And usually we come back to council and we would say, here's what we found. Do you want to proceed? Yes or no? So that's how the policy is operated now. There isn't like a blanketed retrofit program. But that's something, as Adam is talking about, when we look at the goals and we look at the data and what it tells us about how our system is being used and by who is it being used by, and for what purposes, then we can start to say, like, how big do these gaps, how big of a piece of the puzzle are they? And do we, like you said, do we need to prioritize them in a certain way? Change the way we're doing our policies are affecting our transportation.
Now, this is the most important thing for me. It's just, how do we rationally, we've got a finite number of dollars. How do we invest those for the best public good?
Yeah. It's a great question.
To your point too, Tim, I mean, this looks like it's formidable, but some of these are actually in county, are shown in counties, for example, north of 13th. That's Stagecoach Road, I believe. Going up there. And, out there on the east side of town, there's some roads that are, black lines that are outside the county. And I was curious, on East Lincoln Way, is it anticipated that there'll be actually sidewalks or some kind of, multimodal trail on either side of East Lincoln Way?
So looking at the complete street plan, when you get to industrial areas, it would want either a trail according to a trail network plan, or it would want some kind of pedestrian path separated because of speed and volume and nature of trucks. Like that type of road and the land use would still want a pedestrian or bike facility on both sides of the street.
And it's the southwest area, and south is, there's lines shown that are outside the city limits, and there's also by Bergeson's property. There's actually now a paved trail the county did, and actually goes out to what is it that I call it the South Dakota extension.
Oh, R38.
It goes out there too. So probably be good to get some updated.
Well, one of the things that this plan will do, as council you're also members of the policy committee for the MPO. So we'll look at regional connections for our system, especially when you get into the trail network. And if there are jurisdictional considerations, it just won't be part of the funding unless that funding is like an MPO funding. And then it would just be something that we would prioritize and rank. And if it did include another jurisdiction, we'd have to coordinate the projects the way you've seen those be done with the MPO.
Thank you.
Yep.
How recent is this data, Damien?
The planimetric data
It shows
The plan of
October
yeah, this-
17th.
Yeah, we performed this analysis in October, but the input data we received from the city.
I'd have to look at so when we do our aerial photography and we do LiDAR, that's how they determine what is impervious or not. I'd have to look at that data delivery how current that is. So you'll probably see stuff where we know there's new subdivisions that have been built. So there could be a very small percentage that just isn't there yet because when the GIS data was collected.
I was just noticing the area that we've had sidewalk disputes about on 14th and 15th, which still is showing as no sidewalks. And I'm hoping we took care of those, at least on one side of the street.
Yeah, it absolutely would not be current enough to capture those at this point. So,
Thank you. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about where people walk and bike, because this influences a lot of how we think about where we should prioritize connections, where we should put new connections and so forth. The city has data from Streetlight, which is one of those big data sources that looks at all sorts of multimodal trip characteristics. And you can filter that data down, which we did, to biking and walking, and identify it based on, and I believe these are census blocks. Is that what that looks like to you? Yeah. Where trips are originating and where they're ending. So the maps on this slide show on the left where their trips are originating for people biking and where they end for people biking. I did not include in here maps for walking because they were practically identical to these. So, just imagine this is for both. Unsurprisingly, the majority of trips are starting at Iowa State campus or starting downtown and ending at the same locations. You'll also notice that big census block in the southeast corner, which kind of irritates me a bit because it's such a big census block. It really makes the analysis challenging, but that includes Target, it includes Walmart, it includes a lot of that South Duff commercial area. And so I think that's one of the reasons why that pops up so much, even though there's a fair amount of that is either undeveloped or very recently developed.
I have no idea what this slide is showing. Maybe everybody else gets it, but how does this slide work?
So the map on the left, the more blue that an area is, the more biking trips start within that area.
How they tell that?
That's proprietary,
Maybe-
I'm sure is what
Maybe
that
we don't
means.
want to know. I don't know.
Yeah, so Streetlight uses all sorts of, so we've got another model in here, I'll show you in a second, but it uses all sorts of data sources, including traces on Bluetooth devices and so forth to see the paths people are taking when they travel, and it builds all that into a model.
So that's a very interesting data point. If that's true, if South Grand business districts are getting a lot of bike traffic, it's sort of terrifying for me from the standpoint that South Duff is one of the worst places to bike in the community. I guess that surprises me to see that. I didn't understand the slide.
There are a lot of apartments in that same census block, though, down on South 16th. And so my guess would be that along with Target and Walmart, there'd be a lot of people starting their trips at Copper Beach, or is the quarters down there?
Yeah, and going up towards campus and back.
And
How will you use this? Maybe it's better to know. How will you use this data? I mean, is it just fun facts to know and tell, or is it actually something that's going to generate or actually drive some of the decisions councils are looking at making?
This particular data in my mind is more of a snapshot, kind of an interesting data point of just this is what this data source is telling us. There's other data that I'll show you in a minute that I put a little bit more stock in terms of influencing how we move forward. This is kind of just showing you what one data source is saying.
I'd be really curious to hear Bronwyn's perspective, and also, the Ames Bike Coalition that really has a good handle on where people are biking, and just see if it validates based on observations as well too. But
I think the big takeaway from this slide, as far as what means to me, is that the areas where you are walking and biking, that there isn't like a one place where maybe everyone is living and everybody's trying to get to one spot. It's somewhat contained in the activity level. So when we start to look at and say, where are the missing gaps? How do we prioritize projects? We start to look at those brighter colored segments first, maybe to the point that maybe South Duff, because there is a lot of activity and all the services that are down there, that it would rank higher, and we should be not surprised if it ranks higher if there is missing infrastructure. But as far as this data set can also go all the way down to the segment level as far as the origin destination to try and figure out travel patterns and where people would go. But this is more of where are our hot spots, and do they match up with what we know? I mean, a little bit of this is validation of our own experience doing this type of effort for our community. So
just seems that the census tract in Friel Drive in the industrial area out there just seems, don't drive out there a huge amount, but I am out there. It's very rare I see a bicycle out there. So it's just, that I'm just trying to parse out and help think through that. Not that the people don't bike out there, but if you're going to prioritize it because of this, it's, make sure get some more validation on it.
And we do have other data sets, as Adam said, that would provide detail to that unfortunately large misshapen chunk. That actually, what does that mean? Well, we have other things that help us explain that. So.
Right.
Well, I'm a little nervous to move on because I think this may also raise questions. But maybe some of you have heard of Strava or used Strava. It is an app that you can use to track your walk or run or ride. We received the data on we call a network link level. So this is actually showing it on streets and paths. This is the data for pedestrian trips. And I show you this because we did look at this data and we received it, but if you're looking at this the same way I am, this is looking very lopsided on one half of the city. And I would guess two things looking at this. One is that people in Ames that use Strava for their quote unquote pedestrian trips are predominantly using that when they go for a run or for recreational walking. And there's probably a lot more ISU students that use it than non-ISU students. You see the Ada Hayden Heritage Park really lighting up as having a lot of trips, as well as the unpaved trails along the Skunk River back there. That's probably not where there's probably not more walking that happens there than in downtown Ames, but that's what this data shows. And very similarly, when we look at the bike trips, it's very much skewed to getting in and out of town, probably people going out on longer rides, as well as the park up north again.
Do you happen to, the anomaly, which is Hilton Coliseum, is that like people riding around the park?
That's my guess, is that somebody must have organized like a criterium race or something like that, and people rode around in circles.
Yeah, okay. I was like, that's funny.
Or it could have been
That popped out to me as well.
Yeah.
RAGBRAI in 2018.
So all that to say, we did look at that data. I would not put a whole lot of stock in this in terms of helping you make decisions about where to invest in additional infrastructure, but it is an interesting thing for us to take a look at.
People sure like Ada Hayden. We can take that away.
Well, that is for sure. Okay, so one of the other big data sources that I was alluding to that we used is called Replica. It is a company that uses Bluetooth tracking data. They use telemetrics from delivery vehicles. They use a wide variety of data sources to create a nationwide activity-based travel model. There's an adage that says all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. And I think this is one that can be useful for us to take a look at. This slide just shows trends year over year about the total number of trips taken in Ames on a weekday in the fall. This is all trips, all modes, and you can see the purple line, or kind of lighter purple line, the 2020 dip when COVID-19 really happened and everybody started staying at home. The reason I am showing you this slide, the dark kind of navy line is 2019 and the yellow line is 2022. People are traveling more now than they did before the pandemic in Ames, and this is something we see across the country. So traveling is up. Going back to the streetlight data, again, one data source. This looks at the length of trips by mode, and you can see, according to this set of information, the majority of walking trips in Ames are a mile or less, which is understandable. And the majority of biking trips are really kind of under 2 miles or under 3 miles, depending on how you want to add up those bars. So they're shorter trips overall. And this is kind of getting into the next series of slides. When I look at Ames and I look at how far you are from one side, it's 3 or 4 miles one way or another. When we talk about getting people to walk and bike more and drive less, yes, we can get people to bike 3 miles. We get people to bike 4 miles. But the lowest hanging fruit is really looking at that 1 mile or less. And especially when we talk about walking, we can see that as well here. So going back to the Replica model, this model looked at, again, a whole host of data. At a typical Thursday in the fall of 2021, there were 228,000 total trips made by people that live in Ames, and this is by all modes. And so a trip here is if you walk to the bus stop, that's a trip. If you get on the bus and take the bus somewhere, that's a trip. If you get off the bus and you go into the Walmart, that's a trip. You leave the Walmart. So you see what I'm saying? There's a lot of things defined as a trip. And this looks at the modes. What is really striking to me about this is a fifth of your trips were under a mile in length. When you look at the mode taken, that chart on the left, nearly half of those are by walking, which is good. That makes sense. But what's really interesting is if we take out those ultra short trips under a quarter of a mile and we look between a quarter mile and 1 mile, more people are driving than they are walking. And so to me, that's a big opportunity there to look at opportunities to make it better and more appealing for people to walk or potentially bike.
I have a question. That is, the orange route on Cyride is the most heavily used route in the state for public transit. And I forget how many people ride that a day, but it's a lot of people. So how can they gauge public transit when you have so many students getting on and getting off the bus on campus, engaging that? I mean, I'm thinking, because we carry a tremendous, 4 or 5 million riders a year. And if it said fall, if it was summer, I'd say, okay, maybe I get summer, but fall, there's an awful lot of people that get on. How can they tell that?
I cannot answer that question with ultimate authority. I can say that I did ask our replica contact about how they factor transit, and they do pull data from Cyride. They get data directly from Cyride to build into their model. And we talked about this with Sherry Atwood from Cyride as well, and kind of shared some of this information and got some feedback on that. So the answer is they say that they have ways to know whether it's a transit trip versus a walking trip versus a biking trip, but that is part of their proprietary model, and I don't know how they do that.
I question the validity of that one, because you take 4% of 228,000, that's less than 10,000, and I think that there's well over 10,000 riders on public transit on just one route, and we have multiple routes going around the entire city. So if we're going to start making decisions again on this foundational background.
Well, and this is just trips under a mile as well.
Well, sometimes the trips on campus are.
I have
blocks.
seen.
I mean,
I've watched somebody get on one stop and get off.
Yeah. So I get that. I just make sure the data is correct, because you're going to be asking council to make direction and investment of funds into CIPs and that kind of stuff, and make sure we're just not building it on.
I would say the point with showing this is not that these specific numbers matter so much as just identifying the scale of driving that's happening for these short trips compared to the other modes is really the kind of point to make. And I don't foresee using these percentages of transit use versus walking or biking as guiding your decisions.
No.
It's more about finding those opportunities.
So I'm also confused. It's trips between a quarter and 1 mile, and then the other one is trips under a mile. So what's the difference between those two?
The trips under a mile is everything from 1 foot to 1 mile in length. The trips between a quarter and 1 mile takes out those very short trips. So it's essentially taking out walking the dog around the block, or
Thank you.
Well, I think the other thing too, a good takeaway from this data set is that, like Adam said, there's opportunity. And even if it might not be to an accuracy level that we might want, it is also something that we can use from a consistent moving forward to see how effective our policies, our strategies, and things are moving forward.
So unpack that. So you're saying
Well, so
in the future, if we take and use this replica and see if changes are made.
Yeah, so you would be able to maybe look more of like, it's at 45% now. We look 2-3 years down the road, maybe that drops to 40, maybe it drops to second place. Even if within the data and the model, like Adam said, the model has its own built-in error, we can still see all those things given that particular activity moving down and walking moving up.
Makes sense.
John's point about the Cyride Orange route is interesting when you think about those short trips with an auto, because I know a lot of people who drive a short distance to park to take the Orange route. And so I wonder how many of that 45% are people who then switch to public transit because they've parked their vehicle.
Right. That's an interesting question.
And I think ultimately what council will see in this plan is essentially preferred modes of design. So you will see cross sections in the campus should look like X, Y, or Z. And we'll also kind of give some sense of how deficient maybe the network is in certain areas from what we would think an ideal case would be. So that's what Adam was saying, is it won't necessarily change some of the outcomes of what the plan recommends, but maybe might give it slight preference to say, well, this area of town, because of the demographics, because of the nature of the infrastructure, the type of trips, you should start investing here. So if there's deficiencies in and around campus, in and around a social, like a place with lower income folks, that maybe those are the places because they need that trip or they're more likely to take a trip by walking, start there. But it won't necessarily say we're going to have a complete design standard different in campus than we would on the edges of town. We'd still have a type of cross section that would promote walking and biking no matter where you are. Just kind of help us figure out where we need to start and maybe how fast we want to get to the goal of what an ideal case could be.
Okay, so when we look at those trips up to a mile in length, they, in this model, are able to assign those trips to network links. And what a network link is a segment of a street or a path. So if you look, you could actually see the path that crosses Iowa Creek, kind of between 13th and Lincoln. You can see that on the map, actually having a kind of a darker color to it. So what this map is showing is where are those streets or paths that all of these short trips are occurring along. The darker the color, the higher the volume of trips. So you can see the campus streets.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you walk from one class to another class, that's a trip. So you can, completely imagine why there's so many trips happening there, right? Up and down Lincoln Way, a lot of trips as well. But what starts to pop out is Stang Road and up into Somerset. You have the North Grand Mall area having some darker shades as well. Lincoln Way actually heading fairly far west out to North Dakota, South Dakota is a darker shade. You can see the downtown area, and then you can see Duff Avenue popping up as having dark colors as well. Now, again, this is all modes. So if somebody goes to Target and buys something and then drives to, get some lunch, that's a trip. So if they drive their car a half mile, that's going to show up in this as well. Again, the reason to show this is to think about where are there potentially opportunities, where are those short trips happening, where are there opportunities to provide people, and encourage them and provide them places to walk and bike instead of driving for those. Talk about not seeing a whole lot of people biking on South Duff Avenue, but I do think that there's a lot of destinations there. There's a lot of people go there for a variety of reasons. And so if you really wanted to get more people walking and biking, making that an easier place, making those destinations easier to get to on foot and by bike could be one way to achieve that.
The side ride, does the side ride show up also as a trip?
If it's if somebody, and again, with the transit, it's not tracking the bus, it's tracking the people on the bus. So if somebody gets on Ride and rides less than a mile, then they would show up in this.
Which would then make sense in terms of Lincoln Way, south of campus and around campus area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it also, with people walking, they may cut across one of the lawns on campus, but it snaps everything to a network link. So that's why you see clean lines going across the big lawn in the center of campus rather than, things crisscrossing all over the place.
So Adam, stay on that one more second. So when we think about the drivers of our policy, let's take, for example, Damien, I don't know if you have a pointer. Can you show where there's eventually going to be the extension of the bike trail that goes on East River Valley Park and it basically ends at Lincoln Way. And the reason why runners don't go over there is because there's nowhere, it basically ends there. But I promise you, when we're able to add that trail that goes then south of Lincoln Way that connects down to the soccer fields and that connects with the other proposed trail coming in from the west, there's going to be a ton of traffic there. I promise you. So it's just sort of interesting. We've got work and school drivers, but there's also a recreational sense of this. That if we just finish up some of those segments. Another one that's South Dayton. If you could show that,
Talking about right here.
Damien.
Yeah, it's.
So South Dayton is a good example.
I try
We
to.
finished South Dayton,
Cursor doesn't want to agree with me.
so south of Lincoln Way.
There's a gap right there.
There's one of the nicest bike trails in Ames on South 16th, but it ends. It's a bridge to nowhere. But I promise you, we connect that. That's going to be a game changer of recreational users because there's no curb cuts. So people who want to get out for a harder ride, they're going to be loving that because they can make a loop. And so when you start creating a loop, you're going to see a lot more recreational cyclists using that kind of facility. So I'm just trying to. This is what's hard about this is that there are all these kinds of priorities that can drive where we invest our next projects.
I think you bring up or alluding to a really good point, and that is when we look at prioritizing, like setting priorities and make sure we're meeting a goal, we use performance measures. And so one of the things that like Adam is talking about on this particular slide, the performance measure would be trip length. And like how are we doing on a particular trip length? The thing that you're referring to would be, for instance, like connectivity. So you could kind of score a missing segment on how much it may connect and infill a network. As far as, we have this kind of desire to get from point A to point B. Another model that has origin destinations. I know like in the long range plan, we look at that. There's analysis zones that talk about how people move throughout the community. So all those different data points kind of all have their own respective performance measures. And you start to look at the different projects that you might do and how we would target investment. All those different scores that we're talking about add up, and then you would see that project float to the top. So I think it will be captured, and I think will make a lot more sense when we start to look into the draft plan. That idea of performance measures and having a candidate list of priorities. Council, as I said, has seen that as your roles as NPO. It'd be something very similar, but for biking and walking infrastructure. So you'll have a lot of different factors that play into what is the most important thing to do and why. So, I mean, what you want, you will likely see once we get the draft plan.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so we talked about safety earlier and looking at crashes, and as Damien mentioned, especially fatalities are thankfully relatively low for people walking and biking, although they should be zero. But looking purely at the historic crashes that have occurred only tells you one part of the story. So we have performed a systemic safety analysis both for walking and biking, where we looked at the historic crashes, meaning the actual crashes that have occurred, and then also looked at the potential future crash risk. So the historic crashes are the kind of red and orange lines on this map. This shows the density of crashes that have occurred along the street network. And I would say that this is influenced by the amount of activity that occurs. So Lincoln Way would likely have more crashes because there is a lot more pedestrian activity on Lincoln Way than there is on South 16th Street. So that is one of the things to consider when you're looking at historic crash data. We used it's called the Safe Streets Priority Finder tool, which we developed through a grant with USDOT and the city of New Orleans, that takes that data and runs it through a fairly complex model to look at the characteristics of the environment surrounding those crashes and find out where those characteristics exist elsewhere within the study area. So if we have a lot of crashes that happen on 4-lane roadways, if we have a lot of crashes that happen where the speed limit's 45 miles per hour, if we have a lot of crashes that happen where, X, Y, and Z are present, we look at other places on your street network that have those same sort of characteristics. So the green lines, those are the potential future crash risks. Now, this doesn't mean that crashes will happen there by any means, but it's saying these are places where those characteristics might increase the amount of risk that is out there. So, you can see State Avenue, which probably does not have a whole lot of traffic on it because there's not a whole lot of destinations along that area, at least relative to Lincoln Way. That comes up as an area with potential crash risk. Far East Lincoln Way and South Dayton come up as areas, again, probably because of the speed limits that are out there and maybe the roadway widths and so forth. But you will see portions of Lincoln Way through campus, Grand Avenue, that are both have the green lines and the red lines on it, saying that, yep, some of these roadway characteristics do lend themselves more to some of the pedestrian safety considerations. And then I'll just flip to the slide on biking. We, change the colors just to be able to tell the maps apart. But in this instance, the blue lines are the historic crashes and the red lines are the potential future crashes.
And then what this means as far as like what will we do in the plan? Again, I still go back to the idea that each roadway type, kind of the topology of what the actual plan will suggest should be our design, should be our ideal network. We'd be able to go to each one of these segments, and safety being one of the performance measures I was alluding to, you'd be able to look at that segment and say, what is missing? What do we need to put in that segment if there's anything missing? And then rank it and prioritize it. So the data isn't trying to make an affirmative in one way or another. It's just trying to, how do I make sense of a very large, complex network to identify areas that are of concern for safety, for other different kind of issues. So I think that's what this tool is really helping us do is provide a little detail to what can be a really noisy network.
So could you explain why is that red line up there going up to Ada Hayden? We've created a fantastic bike connection up there.
But that's a great example. So when you look at the type of road next to the trail, it would be the type of road, like Adam was saying, where you would typically have a concern like this higher speed, perhaps higher volume road. Does it have a separate facility? So you look at that segment and say,
it does.
Yes, it does.
This doesn't take that.
That's where when we start to actually build a plan, you use these tools. That's why we hired tool. But when you put together a plan, you go through and you filter these things out. So if it's not a deficient corridor because can you go back to the other slide? Another example too, for instance, was we looked at the 13th Street extension. Well, that has a very nice trail on it. So if it didn't, then we would look at that segment and say, what's missing? We probably need to put a trail in.
And those crashes that did happen on 13th, there were before there were sidewalks on both sides?
No, that's a potential future.
No, the historic.
You're talking about the red lines.
Oh,
Yeah.
But that green segment on Ontario, that has to be sort of like what we were seeing on the other slide,
that's under the
because that's a
viaduct,
separated
right?
trail.
That's under
It's
the
raised
viaduct.
above the roadway.
Yes.
So we
that's
filter
right
it
down the
out.
hill by the,
Right. So
by
it
Furman.
wouldn't be something
no,
that
not
would
Ontario, isn't.
lend itself to becoming a project because we don't have a deficiency in that corridor.
Right.
So
And that's,
Right under the.
It's red. It's orange, but yeah.
yeah. And to Damien's point, all of these things as we go through this are going to be layered on top of each other. And so there may be things that show up as a huge red flag on one analysis, but when it turns out that's not a project we're going to be looking at, then it sort of becomes a bit moot, if that makes sense. So it's different layers of analysis. Luckily for my job security, we don't have a calculator we can just plug everything into and here you go, here's your bike plan. But there are pieces that we look at and relate them to each other and kind of use some judgment to figure out how they should interact.
On that one too, that's university property, that little hook part north of Lincoln Way there.
Yeah.
On the last map too.
Yeah, it's Beach Road, I think. Yeah.
And I think that kind of our impulse is always that we look at things in more of an absolute, right? Something is dangerous, something isn't dangerous. What this analysis does is it kind of looks at the general type of roadway and says, typically, or the tendency would be for this road to have problems. Go look at it. Yeah. So that's all that really this is telling us. It's not making it an affirmative that it is a safety issue. And obviously the crash history, there could have crash history. You could make an improvement and then see a reduction in that crash history. And it takes some time for these maps to change.
How many crashes are we talking?
In total? I mean, I can get that data. I don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay, I was just curious if you had any sense for how many it might be.
But you made the point, Damien, a long time ago. I mean, we're talking about Welch, that a lot of the bike accidents are never reported.
I don't believe that.
So it's sort of we don't really have firm data on that.
No, we don't. And I mean, one of the things that you will see that we are using some tools. You remember when we did the CIP presentation, we talked about Airport Road by Sam's Club.
Yeah.
And all the way over to the intersection of South Duff and Airport Road. We had a company that used higher level video analytics that can actually look at near misses and things like that. But you can't do that level of effort on a citywide scale. Right? So near misses, there is technology to do it, but it's a very focused effort. And so some of these maps might say, for instance, look at like Beach and Lincoln Way. Maybe you need to go and look at where the near misses is because it's a high potential area. Even if it might not be generating crashes, it has some concern about how it's designed. Maybe go look at it. And so that's where we can drill down or plan to do a study. In those, for instance, we might do corridor studies or intersection studies. That's what some of these data sets will help us do is help further efforts.
To me, it's what's sort of interesting. South Duff there. So when I ride down on South Duff, I've had more near misses on Lincoln Way and Duff than anywhere else in town by far. And then because there are all these curb cuts and drivers aren't looking necessarily for pedestrians and cyclists on that intersection as much, but it's interesting that doesn't even show up on that map as an area of concern.
Well, but that's my answer to that is like, that's why we have a community advisory committee. That's why we have public meetings. These aren't islands. Like none of these data sets are used independently of professional experience for other data sets. I get that we're really just trying to illustrate like that we're leaving no stone unturned here.
I appreciate that.
In fact, actually, if I can move on to the next slide, I want to talk about some of the other analyses that I think fill in some of the gaps here, which are our stress analyses. So we talked about stress earlier and people's tolerance for traffic stress. This is looking at pedestrian crossings. We have a model that we use that is a kind of an evolution of some work that the Oregon Department of Transportation put together that looks at street width, the number of lanes, the traffic volume, and so forth to identify whether an intersection is stressful to get across or not stressful as a pedestrian. And the color coding here is low stress to high stress. And so you can see Lincoln Way and South Duff shows as a high stress intersection. If we take that and actually just take all of the high stress and make them all the same red dot, this is what we look at. The orange lines on here are where there is where those streets where you're more than 1/8 of a mile away to the closest low stress crossing. So when I come back here, you might look at, portions of South Duff and not see red lines, where it's crossing the creek there, or portions of, University Boulevard where you see some blue and whatnot. But when you actually look at the distances between those low stress crossings, you start to see more barriers. So again, we talk about those trips under a mile. Where should we invest in crossings? Maybe it's places where there's a lot of trips under a mile. Maybe that's why people are driving instead of walking, is because they don't feel like it's safe, especially in some places where there's high stress crossings.
What's a low stress cross? How would you define a low stress crossing?
So a low stress crossing is generally going to be something that most adults feel comfortable getting across. And the metrics for that vary depending on whether it's a signalized intersection or not. If it's an always stop, it's going to be more comfortable than not. So if you go to cross Grand Avenue where there's no traffic signal or stop sign on Grand Avenue, it's going to be higher stress than at a place where there is a signal. And it's also based on the speeds. So the higher the speed, the higher the stress.
So it doesn't mean you have to have either flashing lights or stop signs or stop lights. It could just be something that's visibility, traffic speed, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And I think, we couldn't expect that every crossing is
Right.
going to be low stress. So
Right.
like I live right at
Yeah.
10th and Grand essentially, and I cross there. And it's tricky, but I would never expect us to help me cross at 10th and Grand because I can go down to 9th and cross at the light as I ought to probably for less stress. So there are places where we definitely want to fix it, where it takes a long time. I mean, that's what I like that red or orange line on here because that's really helpful to think about that too, I think.
It's interesting that we've had 2 emails in the last week about pedestrian stress crossing the new Grand Avenue extension, but it's not showing up as a high stress area on the other map.
Is that because it's new? We
I don't
there's
know.
no data yet on it, or
I don't know, but I'm glad that we are not taking everything at its face value.
Yeah.
That we're getting that additional input.
Well, and you
And-
can see, for instance, on like University, it's another street just with very limited crossing. There's not a whole lot of crossings. So where there is a crossing that might be a signal with a protected ped phase to let people get across. And the thing is, like, what I think the takeaway from that is that doesn't necessarily mean that we're done or the problem's been solved. There could be things that we would do and the plan would recommend. The example I would give is what we did along Lincoln Way, where we added that leading pedestrian interval. So maybe there's a type of operation that is not reflected in this data that the plan could say you need to start doing, and then some of those red segments would go away, and you could slowly start to take away those gaps. But for instance, there could be long segments on 13th Street or Lincoln Way that would be, yes, they're an issue. And as development happens or as use increases, then we would start to prioritize those areas. But it's also, this map is also trying to help us like figure out where we start. Where do we start that investment?
Is this assuming that those places where we've installed the rapid flashing beacons are at a higher level of safety, even if people aren't using them correctly?
How level of data for every type of traffic control device?
Yeah, I think we had your pedestrian hybrid beacons as signalized intersections.
Okay. Yeah, and so what Adam is saying is that, yeah, whether it's a signal, whether it's a rectangular rapid flashing beacon, they all equate to a traffic control device of some sort, assuming that when they were installed, it was appropriate for that street.
On a similar note, we have the bike traffic stress analysis, and this takes into consideration your street network as well as the path network. And so whereas there are some places where the street itself would not be comfortable for most people to bike on, there's a path immediately adjacent. And I think that far north Grand Avenue extension is one where the path is far enough away from the roadway that both lines show up. And that's why you see a red line still there. But there are other examples like along 16th, portions of 16th Street that have the path essentially within the right of way. And so again, the stress levels show up from high to low. And you can see places where the stress is higher, especially, Grand and Duff and Lincoln Way and 13th sort of surrounding the downtown area. So, as we look at, kind of going back through all of these things, the stress levels, the crash risks, the potential for trips to happen, so all of these maps where we start to pile all these things on top of each other, that takes us to the point of here's where we need to start drawing some connections. And maybe these are places where we start to need to have crossing projects, and we'll put all of that out on a map, and that'll be, first for the advisory committees to look at, say, this, we think something should be added, or maybe this should be changed, or yes, this looks good. And then we'll have opportunities for public review of that as well. So again, these analyses don't say this is ultimately the answer to everything, but this is data that we use to kind of help inform that next stage of decision making.
I love this bike stress map. There's two I mean, I guess it's just a thought, really. One is that it's sort of high stress there, yellowish on 6th, between Duff and Grand
Mhm.
there. And then Northwestern. And Northwestern is supposed to be a bike friendly street, right? It's got those signs, bike friendly street. It's on our map of the biking network. So it makes me wonder, like, if you overlaid these stress levels on our city biking map, like, are we, which of those roads that we are encouraging people to bike on as a biking route are high stress? Like,
Yep.
those we need to be looking at. So, like, Northwestern there, especially, is one that's like, oh, we really need to be thinking about that, because we're telling people it's a bike friendly route, but it's quite high stress. And then same with 6th, has a real nice path once you get on the west side of Grand, of course, but it's high stress till then. So anyway, those are just my thoughts. Like, we shouldn't be asking people to, like, bike on a high stress route.
Well, I think what you're bringing up is a great point, which is why I think these efforts are important, because when one designation was created, it was probably created under a certain traffic condition, under certain standards. And I think one of this effort does is it takes a fresh look at all of those. What are the current standards, current best practices, current traffic, and so forth?
Yeah.
And do they still meet a certain criteria, or should they be revised or changed? Or, for instance, if we want to maintain that as a bike-friendly route, here are the improvements we need to make on it.
Get rid of the parking.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll look at it, and if it's high stress, maybe it's, do we find another route, or maybe the route makes sense and we say we should add bike lanes,
Yes.
or we should reduce speed, or we should do something to make it more comfortable.
And my favorite segments are, for instance, like Lincoln Way, just west of Dayton, in Dayton itself. We already have projects programmed for that. So those 2 segments, are gone as soon as we build the project.
And Damien, remind us too, in the north side of Ames, we a lot of conversation, cyclists going up to Gilbert. So eventually on the west side of Hyde, eventually that's going to be paved. We'll have a path on the west side.
Yep.
And then remind us on 108, I'm sorry, it's 180th, 190th?
90.
Yeah, 190th.
That's makes
So will that eventually also have a trail?
So we have a consultant hired to do that corridor study, and they're making recommendations of, and they're applying the complete streets plan to that corridor study. So when we look at all the different intersection designs and what happens in between, it's a long-winded way of saying, yes, we will look at that and say the complete street plan says a residential collector should have this type of facility next to it. The challenge there, as you know, is we have shared jurisdiction. We have a rural section with ditches, but it would say that we need to solve that problem. So we need some kind of facility because there is a trail, as you know, that goes on the east side of GW Carver, on the west side of the golf course, and ends at 190.
Right.
So we should maybe look at trying to create a trail that connects at least over to Hyde, potentially maybe over to 69, but that's the highway adds another challenge. So.
Okay, thanks.
But there would be some stepped infill there.
Yeah.
The railroad is also fun to work with. So.
Okay. All right. Well, then the third section on the agenda is a hot off the presses sneak preview of the wayfinding concepts. And I want to kind of go through and I'll preface by saying I am not the wayfinding expert. Sonia Heichel, who is in the Madison office with me, is one of our company-wide wayfinding experts, and she's been leading up this work and is engaged with the technical advisory committee on some initial steps from this. So I'm going to kind of present a little bit of some of her content. But essentially getting at, when we talk about wayfinding, there's several steps that people use to figure out where they're going. And especially if it's a place you've never been before, you probably look it up on a map somehow. Then you figure out, which way you're going. Maybe it's a map like this photo of this person, but it could also just be a street sign so you know where you are and which direction you're heading, so on and so forth. And then ultimately you see the sign to let you know you're at your destination. When we are, for this project, and we're talking about a wayfinding system for Ames for biking and walking, it's really a focus on these middle steps in helping to, give people the tools that they need to orient themselves to the overall street and path network, to let them know where they are, where they need to make a turn, and then to confirm that they're going the right direction. So, best practices in wayfinding are, first and foremost, that it should be simple and easy to use. The sign should not be overcomplicated. People shouldn't have to stop their bike to read the sign and get, directions and so forth. We also want to make something that is easily adaptable to different types of scenarios. It does need to be consistent, and it needs to be predictable, and people need to sort of understand and expect the types of signs that they're going to see. One of the first steps that Sonia did was what we call discovery, which is taking a look at existing branding and signs and so forth that's out there within the community. One was reviewing a 2016 report that looked at wayfinding needs in Ames, and that included some useful recommendations. The two signs that are shown here on this slide are ones that there was a survey as part of that project that had the most popular or were the most popular with the respondents. And part of that is because of the inclusion of maps. We also looked at existing branding. Your city brand is very colorful, and I think it reflects. And I was noticing your community vision statement over here about innovation. I mean, I think it reflects kind of the smart and innovative aspects of your identity that you put forth. Obviously, there's the Iowa State University branding as well, and the existing wayfinding signs. And then there's sort of a bit of a mismatch, or not mismatch, but a variety, a collection of things that we sort of clustered together under this kind of prairie limestone look. Your park signage includes stonework. You have a lot of the sort of reddish brown painted posts and light posts and bollards and so forth. There's this interesting yellow and green and wood post sign that exists. So we took a look at those things, and through all that came up with 3 concepts. And as I said, you're getting a sneak preview of these. Our next steps will be to show these to the advisory committees and get some feedback. But here's what we're looking at, kind of 3 ideas. One is really playing off that prairie and limestone palette. So you'll see some kind of timber or wood posts, more of a organic green, a green that's got a little bit more yellow in it, a sort of beige color as well. And then the option to have some color coding on the tops of some of the directional signs to reflect different zones or locations within Ames. You can see the Iowa Creek Trail branding on some of these posts to kind of help orient users or sort of give you a sense of where you are in relationship to the overall system. The second concept is a bit more modern. It includes what we're referring to as a fold. If you think about your city logo, the A, how the A kind of folds over on itself at the top, it has the color changes. We sort of incorporated that into some of these signs with that cropped corner in it, which has kind of a two-tone color with the green to kind of reflect that. It's a bit of a brighter color palette that is more reflective of your current city branding. And then the fourth option is a bit more conventional in terms of the green color used. It's the standard directional sign green. This is using the brown painted posts like you have. It does have some unique elements to it though, like the Iowa Creek Trail branding example shown at the top of some of those paths, some of those posts. But the thing that really makes this one unique, and the main idea here, is a color coding by route. So this could be different trail corridors might be color coded, or again, different parts of town could be color coded. The way this is mocked up, downtown is blue and Iowa State University is red. No surprise there. So the red arrows are pointing toward destinations in the ISU area. The blue arrows are pointing to destinations in the downtown area. Maybe the North Grand area is yellow. You could have different colors for different locations. So those are kind of the 3 concepts that we come up with so far that we want to present to the committees to get reaction and feedback on. The next step from there will be to take those into further reaction from through public survey or something along those lines to get some comments and move forward with that.
And we've also spent quite a bit of time, at least initially, trying to get some discussion on what we sign, like what are destinations, what would be shown on this sign, the kind of information that's provided. So once we get further into the plan and have a draft to be able to share, we'll have a lot more detail in addition to what it looks like.
With that, this is the last slide I have, which is just sort of a refresher on the overall project path, pun intended, about where we're heading. We are getting started with the initial recommendations or ideas around network development, which is really building upon the existing conditions. And then, the wayfinding sign design, we have the concepts developed. The next part will be, getting feedback and reactions, and but we'll start looking as well at the types of routes to be identified overall. There will be 2 more stages of public input, as I mentioned, that are going to happen in the spring, and then we're sort of at this point knowing that the summer is kind of a time when we really shouldn't be doing public input. We need to do it while ISU is in session. The summer will probably be when we are getting the plan put together and drafted and everything, and then early fall will be that opportunity for the public review of the draft plan and so forth. And that's all I have.
Would it be helpful for council to give any impressions on the wayfinding concepts, or just take it to committee and then come back?
I just had a question about the wayfinding. Are you looking at all at wayfinding for folks who maybe are vision impaired? Like, is there sound involved in any way, and any of the signage that you're considering?
That is a great question, and I can't answer that one myself. I would say that the answer is typically that no, there's not sound involved in those. I have heard of audible wayfinding signs, typically more along paths or something that's in a bit more of a controlled environment, which could be a possibility. I think there's there have to be a whole lot more thought put into that in terms of how that functions, and testing, and getting electricity to all those locations, and what is the message said, and so.
Okay, thanks.
Very good question, though.
Well, obviously, it is something that doesn't have an easy defined standard, like a traffic signal has a standard for audible signals. But what I guess that would tell us is that areas where there are crossings, remember the discussion on critical cost crossing areas, making sure that there is, like, the part of the network is all part of an accessible route, and what elements need to be included in an accessible route, this plan can certainly speak to. But it gets a little bit blurry when how creative you can be with that, as you can imagine.
Thanks.
Anything else from us tonight?
I had a-
Go ahead, Brian.
I had a question. For next steps, implementation strategy you have for spring of 2023. And we'd asked a question before about, and I wonder how best to look into it. If we're spending enough per year on bike and ped improvements, and if that will be part of that implementation strategy. So funding levels that are going to be needed to, to meet any goals we're setting down. Is that?
Well, what we'll do, and we work together, and we coordinate with our finance department. So what we do is we take historical funding, current city policies for funding for this activity, and what we typically might get for grants or any other type of external funding that we could apply to this effort. And then we'll forecast out, and that'll kind of the first initial will be how much we can do, how quickly we think we can do it.
Right.
And then certainly that could be something that when we present the draft plan, I guess I'll have to talk with Adam how much, whether we could do like a higher funding scenario or lower, some sensitivity analysis, if you think about it that way, To what extent we can do that. But for instance, when we present the draft plan, council can certainly look at what your current policies will get you and how quickly that will infill the network or bring it up to the standard the plan is anticipating.
Yeah.
And then if that's not enough, then you could give direction. But obviously, taking funding usually has to come from somewhere. So that's where we would work
Well-
together and talk about maybe the impacts or how we could bring in extra funding to this effort. But it would usually impact another part of the city's priorities.
And I guess it was sort of a related thought on that was, are there metrics or benchmarks, I guess, for the percentage or proportion of a city's funding for transportation that are going to bike ped versus going to, what we would envision as automobile? And are we in the range of what a best practice benchmark might be? Does that exist? Where are we at? As my other thought on that.
I'm sure a data set of that type exists.
Yeah.
We haven't looked at it. I think one of the things we can certainly ask around after this meeting and figure out maybe how we set with other sister communities,
Yeah.
other similar communities that might have a college or et cetera. It seems to me just our experience is like, for instance, council's investment in biking infrastructure, like having a dedicated activity seems to be fairly unique for us. So we can certainly see how we stack up against similar sized communities.
Cool. Thank you.
So I want to come back to the children for just a second. So would it make sense, I'm just brainstorming, to reach out like to the parent teacher associations of the various schools? So it'd be helpful to know for Sawyer School, do the parents think that their kids have safe routes to schools? And if they have suggestions, it seems like that's a piece of this that I'm still not convinced that we're grabbing hold of. And we want to get this right. And I'm just concerned that we're not drilling down specifically because they're such important users. If we want us to be safe, I think we want to hear from parents, specifically around the schools.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, so the school district is on our technical committee. And so we have contacts there. Obviously, they can get us in contact with any school principal. And my experience is especially the elementary school principals have been very accessible. They're very easy to work with. So we can certainly reach out to them. I know that on our advisory committee, I believe we have some people who at least to themselves identify having young children, so they can provide like a parental perspective. It is very difficult to get direct feedback from a minor group, a group that are minors, without having their parents involved in some way. But we have representation, either both the advisory and the technical committee, for people who work with people with young children. So
yeah, I guess I'm still, you can mull this over, but I think the PTAs would be a good source.
Okay.
And it's going to vary across the board in terms of your elementary school principals. So you take someone like Mr. Jeffs at King Mitchell. It's awesome. He's been there forever. He knows the neighborhoods. He would be able to give input. But there are some elementary principals that haven't been there long enough and may not have that sensitivity. So the PTAs, I'm a parent and I want to send my kid on their bike to school. That's a risk, right? And so I'm going to think through with my child. We get on here and I'm going to ride with them. They're just going to see things from a different perspective. So for what it's worth, I think the PTAs could be a good source of information.
And I think a good thing there too, one of the hopeful outcomes of the plan could also make recommendations on essentially encouragement activities. So like walking school buses or getting group rides for people to go together. So if you're a parent of a young child who would like to, one of the barriers is just not being comfortable with biking because you're not familiar with the neighborhood or whatnot, that you could get together with people who do have that information, who are comfortable.
Yeah. That's
and
good.
Do some educational training. And
I like it.
that. Yeah.
Have we made sure that the emails that we've been receiving about this have gone to Damien or somewhere?
I received, I guess I couldn't tell you, right, I have a comprehensive list, but like every email that we've gotten, I've shared with Adam and his team. Any recommendation for a community advisory committee member, we've shared and reached out to. So, but if you feel like there's send it again. If you have something that from your constituent and you're not sure if we've gotten it, feel free to send it. We still have plenty of time, as Adam showed, to do public outreach and get people involved.
And send it to the address. You want to give that address again
Yeah.
for people who might be watching?
It's walk, bike, roll, all one word, no spaces, at cityofames.org. And it's in the slide too. I know if you're looking at the city council meetings and you go to this slide, like the second or third slide has the city's website, which is cityofames.org/walk-bike-roll. And that'll get you, and at the bottom of the page is that email address that you can send information to.
All right. Any final questions? Thank you, Adam, Damian, and John. Appreciate your feedback. Nice presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. We're going to move on to disposition of communications to council. We have 4 letters. The first is an email from Alan Hulswas regarding city use of LED lights and his concerns. Is there any interest in doing anything with this? Otherwise, we can respond to him and just say, appreciate your interest, but no action is being taken.
I would move that we just get a memo from staff as to our current policies as they regard to night lighting.
Second.
Steve mentioned something about there being a dark sky policy that the city is using, and I just wanted to know what that is ourselves so that we can use it when in a response, perhaps.
So specifically a policy on,
I think it was called something like dark sky, night sky. Steve, do you remember what it's called?
I do, but I think he wants something else. He just wants to.
he wants us to he wants to change what
He wants to change the lights out, regardless. Of
Yeah, no, I was just for our own info. If you could just send us
Okay.
just a memo on what we've got currently in place for any sort of
policy on night sky and
night
lighting.
night.
And there's
policy.
been a tremendous change in that. I mean, we're putting more of the light down and.
Yeah.
I think he's worried about the spillage into his house, though, isn't he, too?
Well, in color, he wants red spectrum.
Well, I'll give it as much as one. That's,
Yeah, I just so
I
that
think it's going to be
we're.
addressed as only issue, though.
Yeah, I don't know that it'll address his concern to start
Well, you
to get info.
just as an
to
option, you
get-
can say is
I get it.
on the policy of night sky lighting and types of fixtures or what they're.
Yeah, and the LEDs, what we use
Yeah.
now and why we use it.
Yeah, that's just what I want
Should
to
have
know
next
on. Yeah.
All right, those fair motion say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Carried. Okay, email from Will Detterman. He appeared at our council meeting and he was just following up with his comments. Any action on this?
So that's one of the emails that I was referring to that seemed to have input for the bike ped master plan. Has it been forwarded to Damien?
No, but I certainly can take care of that. Just forward it to him and say, please put this in your bucket.
Does that require a motion?
No, and I'll let him know that it's being passed on.
John's here. He'll tell him.
Okay. Did you get a copy of it, John?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so would you mind following up with him then? Just let him know that it's being forwarded on to Damien as part of the studies going on, and
Sure.
thank you for his input. Good, thank you. There is an email from Mike Templeton regarding a downtown shuttle to alleviate parking concerns.
I would move that we respond that we'll take no action on that one at this time.
Okay. Those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Carried. And last is an email from Steve Martin on a pedestrian path on North Hyde and Grant Avenue.
I mean, we talked about this a bit tonight. I mean, eventually this will happen.
So this was one that came up because of the capital improvements plan discussion, but is it also something that relates to the bike ped master plan and could be forwarded.
Well, it could be, but it seems like he's just basically asking that council put in the CIP, getting the path going because we're spending how much money we're spending on projects. So it's my understanding that this is all part and parcel of a developer agreement all along, North Hyde. Is that correct? I mean, John, you want to comment on that? Did you saw this from Mr. Martin?
Yes, I saw that email, and you're correct. It's part of the development agreements with the properties on the west side of Hyde as they develop towards 190th.
So just out of quick curiosity, if the city were to go ahead and put them in at this time, does that make null and void their requirement to provide that?
Sure.
I mean, we all wish it was done now,
Right,
but I just think
right.
we have to be patient and it'll happen eventually.
Okay.
We're going to tell them that.
So I guess the question is do you want to ask if John can respond to say what the status of it's in the plan regarding these and or I can certainly follow up or John and I can follow up and just say that, council asked us to let you know, we know it's important, but it's part of a developer agreement and they're responsible for it. We gotta be patient. Is that right?
Yeah, John can respond.
Okay. All right. Thank you, John.
Council.
Okay. All right.
So we have 2 out of the 4, right?
So John, can you come to every meeting and we'll just delegate it all to you? Would that work?
That's right.
Sweet.
All right. All right. Very good. Council comments. Brown, we'll start with you tonight.
Nothing for me. Thanks.
Rachel?
Nothing fine.
Amber?
Nothing for me.
No, nothing.
Just to thank you, John, you're still here, and to Damien and to Adam. This is fun stuff. This is one of the reasons I ran for council. And so it's fun to think about how the future of Ames will be impacted by this stuff. So it's just a great time to be in Ames. And John, appreciate your leadership, giving thought to the safety of our citizens and trying to address these things. This is something you've had as a priority since you've been in your chair. And so this is just providing additional insight for you, but appreciate your leadership all on the way on this subject.
Gloria?
Thursday is George Washington Carver Day, and there is an event on campus for that. I'm looking forward to that. Other than that, I don't have anything.
All right. Well, council, is anyone going to be around town on July 25th this year?
Have to skip our council meeting that day.
That's a topic of discussion coming too. Just want to thank the RAGBRAI decision makers for selecting Ames to be on their 50th anniversary ride. We're looking forward to welcoming everybody and their best friends to Ames, and they're anticipating a lot of people coming.
It's one of the best events we've ever had in Ames was that last drag ride.
Yeah.
So much fun. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So we do have a council meeting that night.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about that, how we're going to do that. Anyway.
No.
That, or we could invite everybody into the council chambers that night and have a really full council chamber.
I think we had a discussion about that last time, and we could have the city council meeting in Jack Trice and invite everyone
Yeah.
to our meeting.
So anyway, just exciting announcement. And also just we're going to be kicking off our budget review this Friday at 2 p.m. And looking forward to staff giving us feedback, and then put your seatbelts on for the next few weeks in terms of our meeting. So with that, I entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All right, those in favor say aye.
Hi.
We are adjourned.
Yeah.